Hello and welcome to The Reassembler with me, James May. It's a show where we put things back together again. That's it. This might be a good time to tell you a little bit about the history of the lawnmower, which was invented by Edwin Beard Budding in 1830. He was actually inspired by a machine that removed the pilling, or whatever you call it, from fabric at a factory that made uniforms for army officers, I think. And he saw that and thought, if I make it a bit bigger, it would cut the grass in a very neat, uniform way. A lot of people thought Budding was a lunatic for wanting to make a machine to cut grass. Apparently he had to test it at night so that people wouldn't see him and throw stones at him and all the rest of it. American lawyers are quite aggressive about pursuing that sort of thing, whereas really they should spend more time inventing some new types of cheese. Because as we know, the Americans only really have one type of cheese, which is called cheese. They say, "You want cheese with that?" I say, "Oh yes, what sort of cheese have you got?" "It's goddamn cheese, you communist," you know. Well, it would be very cliche to say at this point, of course, young people these days don't know how to make their own entertainment with the train set or Scale Extric or Airfix or whatever, because they've just got their noses in computers all the time. But actually, if I were 9 years old today, I'd be absolutely thrilled to bits with an iPad. I think it's just fantastic. The internet is the most significant thing that's happened in my lifetime by a massive margin. And if I could have had all that stuff with flight simulators and pocket monsters and so on, I'd have been delighted. I'd have still played with this because I like mechanical things, but I'm not going to suggest that the decline in this has ruined humanity, because it simply isn't true. These are nice, they're gorgeous, I love them, but we moved on, I'm afraid. There's all that wiry stuff underneath which could become tangled and broken and trapped. Terrible things like that. I also have a bit of a phobia about wires. I can't stand looking behind my desk where all the bits from the computer go. I don't like looking behind people's TVs, because if they've got a TV and a hard disk recorder and a Sky Plus box and Apple TV and all the rest of it, you've just got this massive pile of wires, and whatever you do, they always end up all knotted up, and it makes me feel... I get a sort of strange pain in my teeth when I look at things like that. Oh, God, horrible. And we've got this rather nice little thing here. This is German, so it works well. This is a little demonstration of how the internal combustion four-stroke engine works. Piston goes up. As it goes down, that valve opens, and it's sucking in fuel from the carburettor side. Now that valve closes, the piston goes up. Bang, the spark plug fires. Wow, down it goes. As it comes up the next time, that valve opens, that's the exhaust, so all the spent gases are pushed out, and then it starts again. So it's obvious that the relationship between the crankshaft and the camshaft, which is what's pushing the valves up and down, is very important, because if the valves don't open at the right point, then it isn't going to work. And also, if you get it wrong, you won't find that out until the whole thing is assembled and you pull the piece of string and it doesn't go. Then you'll have to take it apart again, and we'll be back with looking for the spring compressor and so on. So would everybody agree that that is top dead centre? There. So the piston is at the top of its stroke, both the valves are closed, but if you rotate it either way, either one is ready to open. So that should make the timing correct. There's no other real way of checking it, apart from assembling the whole thing and seeing if it works. The great development when I was young was the cassette player, because you could buy a blank cassette, say a C90, 90 minutes, and then you could record your records and all your mates' records, and you could make a party mix, which was a godsend. But you couldn't do that like a download. You couldn't sit there and take 10 seconds to download a song. You had to do it in real time with your fingers on the buttons of the tape recorder and the records. You had to listen. You had to have the party by yourself before you could then have it again with your mates. And it was technically illegal. You know, people used to say home taping is killing music, but it didn't seem to be, as far as we were concerned, it seemed to be spreading it like wildfire, because we could all listen to it. Only one person had to actually buy the record. Everybody else could just steal it. It was brilliant. And there you go. That's not bad, but it's not the purest way of doing it. The purest way is to hold the iron and the wire onto the tag, and then apply a blob of solder, so that it flows around it nicely. But the problem with that, obviously, is that you need 3 arms, and that's something you'll hear people saying about soldering all the time. To do it properly, you need 3 arms. Beautiful. I think that deserves a swig of tea. The interesting thing about, well, I say interesting, it's mildly interesting if you're interested in that sort of thing, is that the Suffolk Iron Foundry made the whole lawnmower, a bit like Ford did with cars in its earlier days. So it didn't just buy an engine in from, say, a motorcycle manufacturer, it made it itself. So all these castings and all these machine bits all came out of the same factory that was making the blades, the rollers, the pressed steel, for the casing, the grass box and all that sort of thing. It all came from the same place. Do you know the very first petrol engine thing I ever drove was a lawnmower? It was a twin clutch device, a bit bigger than this one, that my parents owned, and it lived in a shed in the garden. And when I was about 12 years old, I worked out how you started it. And I used to lie awake at night, excitedly thinking about how I could get up in 7 hours' time and mow the grass again, even though I'd mown it at 6 p.m. the previous day. And to be a blade of grass in our garden in those days was a very ephemeral existence. And I loved this thing. This is a form of lower middle class tyranny and oppression, because in the early days of lawns as we understand them, all neat and evenly shorn, that was a sort of privilege of the toffs, really, because it was so expensive to have a lawn cut that way. You needed people who were skilled with scythes and so on to do it. It's an incredibly difficult job and therefore very expensive. But with the invention of the lawn mower, and particularly the petrol lawn mower, everybody could make their lawn look like that. And it actually became a matter of pride and respectability for your lawn, even if it's only, 15 feet by 15 feet in front of your small semi-detached house. It had to be neat, because even I remember as a kid, there were some people whose lawns weren't properly mown, and you knew that they were disreputable. People would say, yeah, but have you seen their lawn? And the fact that it was that long, meant that they were basically thieves and murderers. But anyway, what we are going to assemble next is something that was deeply innovative back in the day. It is the locomotive tender with, are you ready, realistic chuffing sound. Now, that may not sound like much, and it wasn't much. You young people today are used to having the equivalent of all the world's libraries in your pocket. We had a little metal clip that acted against a piece of sandpaper and made a noise vaguely like a steam locomotive, and we were happy. We weren't, actually. We were bloody miserable because the 70s were awful. Nothing worked properly. The lights were always going out. Everything was filthy. The food was terrible. Parents were largely drunk. Rained a lot as well. Now, it's interesting that the two bells, I wonder if I can demonstrate this, are slightly different, because that's what gives a British telephone its characteristic, rather warm and unaggressive ring. Also, we have the rhythm dring, 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 whereas the Americans, you'll know this from films, have dring, dring. The British ring is better, obviously. This is weird. I haven't heard those two tones for many, many years. But it does take me back. A bit like meeting a kid with mumps. Do you know what? Looking at this thing, I am quite curious to use one. There's a great advert that says, I hardly dare repeat it for fear of getting my balls kicked off by the sisterhood. I'm not saying this, I'm quoting the advert, okay, which is from the 60s, I believe. And it says something like, the Kenwood chef does everything except the cooking. That's what wives are for. But just to reiterate, I'm not saying that, and I'm not saying I agree with it. I don't agree with it. I'm merely quoting it. It's a historical document. I can also tell you some things that Hitler said. It doesn't mean I'm a Nazi. It just means I happen to know what he said. Now, I've got a little bit of telephone trivia for you, if you're interested. about the 999 emergency number, which is written on this little piece of cardboard that goes on the front of the dial. And the reason it's 999 is not, as a lot of people imagine, because in the dark you can put your 2 fingers in the dial and find the 9. That's a silly theory, because you could just as easily find the 0. The reason is the telephone works by sending a series of pulses down the line. That's 3 pulses for the number 3. The problem with it is telephone exchanges would take a while to wake up. They couldn't wake up with just a 1. They needed a big number like 0, which is why most telephone numbers began with a 0. And that's one problem. The other problem is that the early telephone lines were suspended through the air, and if they touched each other, that sent a pulse down the line. And on windy days, they would occasionally touch, and you'd get a single pulse down the line. And there was a very good chance that you could get 3 of those in succession, which would give you 111. And if you'd made 111 the emergency dialing number, that would happen by accident all the time. By making it 999, the chances of you getting 3 bursts of 9 collisions of wires are just billions and billions to 1. So it wouldn't happen accidentally. That is why we have 999 as the emergency number. Sophisticated cooking, i.e. making all those cake mixes and batter and whatever else, must have been before machines like this were available. I mean, it must have just taken, like laundry, I suppose, before washing machines were created. It would have just taken days and days of work. I mean, for some people in big posh houses, I suppose it was actually a living doing these things. Well, here's the thing. This is what bothers me. Labour saving. It started with things like this. So cooking becomes easier, mowing the lawn becomes easier, getting about becomes easier because we have bicycles and motorcycles and cars and so on. And then we had the digital revolution. And then the microprocessor and the computer meant that we could work out fantastically complicated things and produce charts and diagrams and drawings that would have taken days or weeks to do on a drawing board or with a piece of paper and a pen. And there's all this time that's been saved by all these things. But where's it gone? By rights, we should all be sitting at home learning to paint or play the violin or philosophizing or something, but we're not. We're still running around like idiots, tending to the very machines that were supposed to save us. Where is all this time we were promised? Where is the leisure society? It's full of people having heart attacks. Time-saving devices free up time to spend with other time-saving devices, like video games or reassembling things, which worked perfectly well before somebody took them apart. The deck part of it, the turntable bit, says Monarch on it. That's because this was made by BSR, Birmingham Sound Reproducers, which is why they call it a record reproducer on there. This bit was brought in from then to the Danset factory and fitted in Danset's case and electrics and so on. So it's a Danset unit with a Monarch turntable in it. The Danset bit was based in London. This bit, the mechanical bit, was made in Birmingham. Same as Richard Hammond, except hopefully this will function properly. Doesn't that look brilliant? If you're still watching. It's hard to imagine. Do you think this has ever happened on television before? I mean, I know there have been some catastrophically unpopular programmes over the years. I mean, anything made by Richard Hammond, obviously. But has it ever got to the point where the only person still interested in what's happening is the person who's on the telly? So there's nobody actually watching it. It's a bit like a tree falling in the woods. If a man is on the television talking about a lawnmower, but nobody sees it, does it actually happen? Who knows? It is. One of the most infuriating experiences in the workshop or garage is to have something, I mean, to be honest, in my case, it's usually a motorcycle or a bicycle, that you've bought off someone else and you do a service on it or a bit of a checkup and you find something that's been bodged. I once had a motorcycle that I bought of somebody and I rode it through town and I thought, this is great, it works really well. And then the headlamp started smoking really aggressively. And then, to be brutally honest, it caught fire. And the reason was a short had occurred inside the headlamp between some of the wiring. A lot of the wiring in a motorcycle is behind the headlight. There was a short between a piece of frayed wiring and the case of the headlight, which would normally blow the fuse. When I eventually got the smouldering bits home, I discovered that the previous owner had obviously blown the fuse at some point and replaced it with just a piece of steel wire, which didn't fuse. So the circuit didn't break and the whole thing just melted. I had to rebuild the entire loom of the motorcycle because somebody couldn't be bothered to spend 25 pence on a fuse. That sort of thing annoys me. The reason I wanted to make a bit of a thing about the dial plate, to be honest, is because those of us over a certain age, I hate having to admit to this because it does make me sound very old, but we do remember a time when most of us did spend our lives dialing by putting our fingers in holes, turning the dial and letting it go back to the beginning. So there you go. The holes, I remember this actually. It's a long time since I've used a telephone with a dial on it, but when the telephone was invented, I mean, the dial goes back to, I think, the 19th century. I don't think the dimensions of it changed since then, but people who were undernourished back then didn't have such big fingers. The holes were always slightly too small. You could get through, say you had a reasonably big number with about 8 or 10 digits in it, you could get most of the way through it, and then your finger would slip out and it would go bzzz back to the beginning. You'd think, oh, cock, you know, you'd have to put the receiver down and start again. You know, you had to make sure you'd been to the lavatory before you used the telephone because you could be caught short halfway through your number. It just took forever. I'm going to tell you something absolutely fascinating. Really fascinating. This is a Japanese-made guitar. It's a replica of a Fender, but it's made by a Japanese company. And these, you would say, are Phillips screws. Agreed, because they've got a crosshead in, but they're not posi-drive because they haven't got the little indentations between the slots. However, if you look very closely, you will see, look at the top there. Can you see there is a very, very tiny centre punch mark? Yes. You can see that. That means that isn't a Phillips pattern screw. It means it's JIS, or Japanese Industry Standard. And it's an important difference because the Phillips screwdriver was invented primarily for the American automotive manufacturing industry. And the point of it is that the shape is designed such that the operator didn't have to worry about exactly how tight he did to screw up. This tool could be powered and it would automatically jump out of the screw when the right torque was reached. Now, the Japanese came up with a slightly different pattern, which means that if you use a Phillips headed screwdriver, such as this one, and a Japanese industry standard screw, you will largely get away with it, but you will also tend to chew it up because the profile of the slot is slightly different. Japanese industry standard screwdrivers are actually surprisingly difficult to get hold of in Europe. But, and how surprised will you be at this, I have 3 of them here in my toolbox because I spend quite a bit of my sad spare time fiddling around with small Japanese motorcycles from the early 1960s, which had Japanese industry standard crosshead screws in them. And if you don't have the right screwdriver, you end up chewing them up, which is why you see a lot of those old bikes with knackered screws in the crankcases. Look at that. That's a Japanese industry standard screwdriver fitting beautifully in that screw. Just out of interest, I mean, it's a small difference when you're doing this. It does make a difference with things like the cases of a motorcycle engine, but if I put it on the Phillips screwdriver, it's not quite solid. There's a bit of, can you see? It's trying to come out. Use Japanese industry standard, solid as a rock. Most people don't know that, and it is true that if you look at a lot of old Hondas and Yamahas and things from that 1960s, 70s period, they have horribly chewed up crankcase screws. The screws were rather soft anyway, the ones the Japanese made. They did that deliberately so you didn't over-tighten them. But if you combine that with the incorrectly shaped screwdriver head, you end up with stuff that you're forever having to drill out because it's been knackered by amateurs who don't understand about JIS. You know, the world is full of Philistines. I've just had a thought. I'm dying to try this out. I've been given this. This is a gift. And I suspect it's been given to me with the intention of making me look like a total knob. But what it is, it's a head-mounted magnifying system. So you get a selection of lenses. You need to put your glasses on to read the thing that tells you what size the lenses are. 2.5. I'm going to try 2.5. So I can't see a thing over there, but if I look down there, wow, that's amazing. There's a light on it, isn't there, somewhere? How do you switch that on? Is that? Yeah, look. How cool do I look? If I wear it down the pub, will I score, do you think? I can't work out where the cup of tea is. So young people observe, in the olden days, our telephone number at home was 01709 37323. So let's dial that. 01709 37323. That's one number. I mean, it's just agony. And often, sometimes, it'd be a bit like filling up the car with petrol. You'd think, I'll ring Cookie. I wonder if he wants to come out to the pub. I'll ring... Oh, I can't be bothered. You'd give up. See, the numbers got gradually bigger over the years because they had to add an extra number to the number for the house, then an extra number to the code, and then another extra number to the code, because nobody ever anticipated how many telephones there would be, and they're still getting it wrong with mobile phones. But then again, when the telephone was a new invention, Graham Bell said it was such a good idea that eventually every town would have one. And I was going to say, actually, since the train set was one of the greatest Christmas presents I ever got, I can also tell you what was the worst, I think, which was a combined folding shoehorn and clothes brush. And I can't remember who bought it for me or why. I mean, it's the last thing in the world I would ever use, and I've still got it in that dark drawer of nothingness that's at the bottom of a wardrobe. It's never even been unfolded, actually, let alone used. And I'd like to tell you about my mate. Well, I'm not going to use his real name in case he's watching. Let's call him Bill. Bill, at the age of 10, desperately wanted a train set. And about 2 weeks before his birthday, he saw his birthday present in his parents' bedroom, wrapped up. It was a train set-shaped box. They were, they were distinctive. You knew what a train set looked like. And he spent 2 sleepless weeks thinking about his train set that he'd wanted for so long. And on the morning of his birthday, he came downstairs, and his parents, being sort of quite old-fashioned and proper, said, well, you can't have your present yet, you must have your breakfast first. So he had a boiled egg and a piece of toast and all this stuff while he slowly wet himself with excitement. And then his parents says, right, you can open your present now. And he tore the wrapping paper off the box to reveal a picture framing kit. But the real tragedy of it was that my mate Bill was left-handed, so he couldn't use it anyway because it was designed for right-handed people. And he will rejoice in telling you that the following year, to make amends, his parents bought him a pair of ducks as pets. Not that he particularly wanted any, but he did the decent thing, and he put them in the greenhouse and fed them and made friends with them so that they would get to know him, and then eventually came the day when he could let them out into the garden and they could go in the pond, and they flew away. I still ring him up on his birthday every year to say, are you gloomy? And he goes, oh, yes. And he's always got a terrible gift of some sort. You know, some sports cars have removable steering wheels. Whenever I've driven a car like that, I've been going along something like an A road, and I've often wondered, can I take the steering wheel off and put it back on again before I have a crash? I think one of the dangers with these is I'd be riding along, hand on the throttle, and then I'd think, I wonder if I could collapse that handlebar and get it back on again before I get to the next bend. And eventually I'd try it. But why wouldn't you? It's like being in a dark room with a tea cosy. You will put it on your head, won't you? Why wouldn't you? I've got to admit to being slightly conflicted about this whole thing, because one part of me really likes putting things together and mending things. If I see a bicycle with a puncture, or a badly crashed Hornby train or something like that, I have a desperate urge to save it. But another part of me thinks that all things from the past should just be thrown away because it's over. Even though I react to a thing like a telephone in bits the way I do when I see one of those appeals to save a sad donkey on one of those charity things. But on the other hand, you have to remember that this is from the 50s, and I don't know, declarations of love would have been made down this thing by people who have since turned to dust. So it's a bit haunted. You'd imagine said, I know your wife's going to find out, but I love you. He's dead. So's she. So's the wife. None of it matters. The poet Larkin said that the only thing that would survive of us is love, but actually he was wrong. It's the Bakelite telephone, because it survived the nuclear winter. So, In the 1960s, the Meccano Empire, which had Hornby Dublo in its stable, went bust, and it was bought by Lines Brothers, the owner of the Triang Empire. And they promised all the toy train enthusiasts, we will merge the Triang toy trains with the Hornby Dublo serious model trains. And they didn't really. They plucked a few bits from the Hornby Dublo range, but mainly they just got the name. Now, it then became Triang Hornby, and that was to placate the enthusiasts. That's all it was. It was still really the Triang toy trains empire. But the weird thing was, in 1972, Lines Brothers went bust because the world was going mad and there were strikes and there was an oil crisis and all the rest of it. And the trains division lost the right to use the Triang name, but they still had the right to use the Hornby name, even though there wasn't really any of Hornby in the train. So they became Hornby Railways, and now they're simply called Hornby. But actually, the trains we get today are the descendants of the original Triang trains and the plastic train set that was made for Marks & Spencer's in 1950. I hope that was useful. Right, what we're going to do now is, because a lot of people do get this wrong and they say, oh no, I didn't have Triang, I had a Hornby train set, but they didn't. They actually had a Triang one. It was just called Hornby. Hornby had gone. The Hornby trains were lovely. The tooling was sold to GWR Wren, and they became Wren Railways, which was also actually a division of the Triang Empire. So the whole toy business is very incestuous. Anyway, never mind that. Look at this. Now, the death of the British motorcycle industry, that is a very big and complicated subject, but a lesson not just for manufacturing industry, but a lesson for life, for everybody, in all walks of it. Up until the 60s, the British motorcycle industry dominated the world. And when the Japanese came along, making things like mundane bikes, really, ride-to-work bikes, as they're often known, the British, and to some extent the Americans, and even the Germans and the Italians, took the attitude that, well, the Japanese, you know, ha ha ha, funny little foreigners, they'll make cheap bikes for people to ride to work on, but the really important bikes, the ones that people desire and where the money will be made, they will be made by us, because we know what we're doing. And the mistake they made was imagining that people like Soichiro Honda and the people at Kawasaki and Yamaha and so on wouldn't say, well, we'll have a go at a big bike as well. And of course Honda did, and everybody was surprised, thinking, well, that's not allowed. But it was allowed. And what we should learn from that is, A, not to be rude about foreigners, because they can do stuff as well. And secondly, it's no good thinking that you will rule the world by making high-end, high-added value things for executives and playboys. All the great car and bike manufacturers of the world are founded on small things for the people. VW, Skoda, Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, Fiat. They made small, simple, cheap things that were accessible to a lot of people, and that gave them their money, their expertise to then branch out and, in the case of Fiat, eventually own Ferrari. In the case of Honda, to eventually become the world's biggest manufacturer of internal combustion engines and producer of the Honda Super Cub, the best-selling machine in history. That's what you get by being humble. Now, this is secured with a grub screw. It's going in with an Allen key, and it's going to be an imperial size, I'm guessing, as this is British and quite old, but I have a set magically. The imperial system harks back to, in many cases, divisions of the human body. So the foot was a foot. The inch, I think, was originally the end of somebody's thumb, and so on and so on. The metric system is, in essence, divisible by 10. The imperial system, its advocates would argue, is great because it's divisible by more numbers. So if you had a shilling, it's quite easy to divide into 2 people's worth of money, or 3 people's, or 4 people's. One of the things I do like about the imperial system is that it's more conversational, if you like. A lot of the units are more easy to relate to. You can say, oh, it missed it by half an inch. You know, you can't really miss something by 12 and a bit millimetres. The imperial system is almost dead, really, for most things. I'll close the lid on the imperial system and put it gently to rest on top of the small metric spanners. Right. I I'm now just going to sit here and drink my cup of tea for a while, because every other one I've had in this series has gone cold. This is metric tea. The thing to remember about the great debate between metric and imperial units is they don't actually change the amount of beer or the lengths of footpaths or the heights of aeroplane above the earth. It's just a different way of expressing it. They're just units. They're just a means of understanding. You could measure them in lengths of Richard Hammond if you wanted to. The aeroplane is 28,000 Richard Hammonds above the earth. As long as we agreed on what a Richard Hammond was, it doesn't matter. It means the same thing. Then you could convert that to meters or feet or furlongs or things to do with the frequency of light. Doesn't matter.